Hi, in this lecture I'm going to show you how to create a minimalistic mobile app using Python and its Kivy library. What we are going to create is this one-page app that you see in here. As I showed to you in the previous video, this app is actually a multi-screen app. So when you click login, you go to another screen and then sign up to another screen and so on. But in this lecture, I'm just going to show you the minimal app, and that's like a template that you can use to write any other apps, no matter if they have one screen only or multiple screens. So I'm going to keep this screenshot here on the screen because this is necessary when you create the interface, the graphical interface, so that you code by looking at your design. This could also be in a piece of paper where you have drawn a sketch of how the interface looks like. So what you need is a Python file. That's how everything begins. And I'm going to name my file main.py. You don't have to name it main.py, but it's a good practice because later on when we deploy our app, when you convert your app to an executable mobile app that runs on a real mobile phone, you're going to have to name your file main.py. So it's a good idea to name it right now, so you don't have to rename it later, or maybe you forget later and you get some errors. So main.py. This main.py is where the logic of the program will be written in Python language. And there's also another file you need to create. You can name it whatever you like, but I'm going to name it design.kv. So you have to use a KV extension. And separate the screen. I'm going to put this in here, main.py in here. And I'm also going to show you this picture down here to keep it there. Main.py should stay here. Alright, so what is this KV? Well, nothing to worry about. It's actually a good thing. There are two ways to create a mobile app with Python and the Kivy library. The first way is to write everything in Python, which means the logic of the program, so the processing and everything that happens on the background with the data you process, the user logins, retrieval of weather observation data or whatever your app does. And the other part of the program is the graphical user interface, which is this thing here. So you some sort of language, you need some sort of language to say, oh, a label with this font size and this font family and this text box and so on. And you can do that in Python, but that is not a good practice. It's a good idea to write that graphical interface in a .kv file in the Kivy language. But Kivy language is very, very simple. You're going to learn it in one day. So I'm not going to show you how to make both ways. So I'm not going to show you how to make an app using both methods, which means the method of having everything in the .py file and the method of having the logic in the .py file and the graphical interface in the Kivy file. I'm just going to show you the right way, which is using Python for logic and KV for the graphics. That's what every professional uses, so please learn this way. And we start from the Python file. The first step is to import all the necessary objects from Kivy. From Kivy.app import app. This is the main object. It symbolizes the app. From Kivy.lang import. If you were wondering how you connect the Python file with the KV file, the answer is this builder object, which I'm going to show you in just a minute. After importing one more object from Kivy.uix, screen manager, import screen manager and screen. And that's it. And then you use the builder.load file method. And there you load the design.kv file. So that's how this script will know about the KV file. Make sure these two files are in the same directory. Main.py, design.kv. And then you go to your Kivy file. The way the Kivy language works is in a hierarchical level. So it's a hierarchy of objects. So this is a screen, and this screen has widgets inside. So if you have only one screen, you're going to write, just give a name to the screen and use these symbols, and then a colon there. So I'm calling this screen the login screen. And then if you have another screen, let's say when you click this button, the sign up screen shows up. Then you want to write another screen like sign up screen, same way. But for now, we're just going to have one screen. And if you're wondering how did I get this purple nice color, well, this is syntax highlighting for Kivy language, and you can use an extension, the Kivy extension. So just search for Kivy and use this extension. So install it and then enable it. And you're going to get syntax highlighting in Visual Studio Code, which is a good thing. So then, the login screen has widgets, I said. Once you press enter, you want to indent with a tab or 4 spaces, just like in Python. So the first widget is a label. But instead of doing that, you want to add another widget on top of the label. It's an invisible widget, but it's still a widget. It's a grid layout. You don't use these symbols anymore. You just use it for the screen. A grid layout, what it is basically the type of area which will have all the other widgets. So down here we're going to add the other widgets. And it's a way to separate the area. So the screen, and the way I'm thinking of separating my screen, of organizing my screen, is by having a main grid layout that will have everything, and then this grid layout will contain 2 other grid layouts. A grid layout for this area here, and this particular grid layout is going to have 1 column and an undefined number of rows, so you can add as many rows as you can in this grid layout. So what I mean is grid layout and then another grid layout. So the first grid layout is this entire grid, which will have 1 column only, and this grid layout is made of 2 grid layouts, this one in here and this one in here. So this one is this, and that is that. The reason I split it this way is because this area here has widgets which are organized in the same way, which means we have only 1 column here. And here we have 2 columns. So in this second grid layout, I'm going to declare cult2, the attribute. And here by default, these grid layouts, they have only 1 column. So I'm going to leave it as 1 column. And then what you add here is label. That's the first widget we have here. Enter and then tab. So everything is indented. Text of the label is in quotes. User login. And then what we have under the label is a text input. The text of the text input, that's not what we want here. What we want here is hint text. So that's username that you see inside the text box. It's like a hint for the user. Username. And so here we are adding widgets as rows for that grid layout. Then we have another text input with hint text. Password. And then we have a button with text login. And then we go to the other grid layout. We have 2 buttons here. With the first one has a text forgot password, and the other one has as text sign up. And that's it. And that's all you have to do for now for the login screen. Now there's also something else here you have to do. So go to the first level of indentation, the same as login screen. You see here, just there. And you want to add another rule. So in the Kiwi language, these things here, in these symbols, inside these symbols are rules. This other rule is the root widget. So it's basically an invisible widget that keeps a record of all the screens of the app. And in this case, we only have the login screen. And this login screen has to have a name. So let's say login screen in quotes. You're going to see later on that we're going to need this name when we refer to the login screen from within the Python file. Because the logic will be written in Python, where you say that if the user presses that button, we're going to say something like screen.current equal to login screen. So we're going to give the name of the screen that Python is going to show when the user presses that button. And that's all we have to do in the Kiwi file. Make sure that you are not using assignment operators instead of colons. So use colons. I used to do this mistake when I was learning Kiwi language, because you are used to Python where you use assignment operators a lot. So have a look to your file and then go to Python. And what we need to do in Python now, we need to create some sort of empty classes which have the same name as these rules in here, which means class login screen use the same case. So I used capital L and capital S in here, same as here, so it has to be the same string exactly. And this string has to inherit from the screen object. So it's going to be a screen object. For now, let's say just pass. And then you have to create another class, which is, you guessed it, the root widget. So every rule here has to be represented by a class inside Python. The root widget has to inherit from screen manager. So don't worry if this code is a bit rigid for now, so you have some rules which seem like a black box, but think of it as just a template. You're going to use this template for every app, so it's a good thing to have. So pass for that too. And lastly, this is the last thing I promise, you also need the class main app. So this is about the app object that we haven't used yet. So this has to inherit from app, that one in there. And this needs a method called build. Self, so every method needs a self parameter. So this build method is actually a method of app. You can see that if you use here. So I executed that line and dear app, you'll see build is among those objects in those methods there. Build. All right, and so that build method is going to return the root widget. But make sure that is the object and not the class. So we are initializing the root widget in here. You can see I'm using the round brackets. And the very last thing is if. And once we have done that, this is the app now. We are ready to execute. But as you see here in the Python file, we are not calling any class. So the very last thing we need to do is, of course, call the main app class. A good practice to do is to use if name equal to main. Then you create an instance of the main app and then use the run method of the main app, which is, by the way, it's a method of app. So you can see run also in here, just there. Save that script, and I'm going to execute now the file and see what we get. I expect, of course, to get some errors because I don't think I did everything 100%. Yes, I didn't get an error, everything is fine in the terminal, but the interface doesn't look as I expected. So I have made some mistakes there. So sometimes you don't get an error in the terminal, which makes it harder to troubleshoot the problem. And if you don't get an error, where you should look is the code in your Kivy file. So in this particular case, it looks like the grid layout is not working as it's supposed to be. And the reason for that is that I didn't specify how many columns the grid layout should have. The main grid layout, but also the other one, the child of that parent grid layout. So before making a change, you need to close this window. I'm going to go here. So I'm going to pass a calls attribute, just like I did with this grid layout. So let me just test it with that parent grid layout first. So this is what we get. As you can see, compared to this, we are not seeing the first grid layout element, which is the label, the username, the password, and the button, because these widgets are actually hidden inside this forgot password button. So they are somewhere in here, in the corner. So when you don't specify these columns, how many columns you have, Kivy will just stuck all the widgets in the lower left corner. So if we close this now and we also add a calls attribute equal to 1, and if I don't save it and I run this again, I'll see the same output. So I need to save this script, Ctrl S, and then run it again, and this time we see what we were expecting, more or less. Well, we still need to add some padding and some spacing between the widgets to make it look like here, but this is what we get so far, and I think it's good. So I'm going to close this now and consider this code as done, but before I close the video, I'll make sure you understand what is going on in here. So this Kivy file, all these things you see here, grid layout, login screen, text input button, these are actually Python objects. Some of them, such as login screen and root widget, are objects represented by classes which we created in the Python file, login screen and the root widget. The other ones are classes you import from Kivy. So if we were to code in Python only, not in Kivy language, we would have to do something like from kivy.uix grid.grid layout import grid layout. So that is the same class as this one in here, but the Kivy file will import these objects implicitly. So it will import them either from your Python file, such as login screen and root widget, or from the Kivy library. In this case, so we are not importing any grid layout here, or the same thing would be with button. So from Kivy uix.button import button. Same for text widget. So we are not importing these objects in here. So that's about the objects. All these are objects, and then you have these attributes of these objects. So if you open a Python shell and you import that grid layout object as I showed in here, and then you do dir grid layout inside the round brackets, you'll see that calls is one of the attributes of the grid layout object. And so that's about the objects. Now about the hierarchy of a Kivy app. It works like this. The highest in hierarchy is the app. So this app object in here. Then comes the screen manager, which is actually represented by the root widget. So the root widget comes after the app. And then we have the screen, which is represented by login screen. So this login screen is just a child of screen. It behaves the same way as a screen. And by the way, we could also have done something else here, which I'm going to show you just now. you could simply pass login screen like that. And then here what you could do is you could add the root widget, which is in hierarchy, it's above the login screen. And then in the login screen, you could pass name, login screen, just like that, and you could delete that. So that would be the same code, and you get the same output, as you can see in here. So this indicates what I just said, that root widget is a parent, and then comes the login screen, and inside login screen you have grid layout, you have another grid layout, text input, and so on. However, to keep the code more organized, because here in the root widget, later on we would have to add another screen like sign up screen, and so this would have its own children, and so on. Then we'd have another screen like login error screen, where the user would be sent if there was an error in the login credentials. And so the code would become too complex. Therefore, what we have instead is we have the login screen as a rule, and also the root widget as a rule, and then we specify that the login screen is actually a child of the root widget using here. And so likewise we add the other screens just the same way. So that's something to keep in mind, because it helps you better understand how Kivy works. And that's what I had about this video, and I hope to see you in the next video.